The room was dark, except for the glow of a computer screen, where lines of code scrolled like an endless waterfall. The teenager at the desk leaned closer, his glasses slipping down his nose, and muttered to himself, "Just one more tweak." The clack of his keyboard filled the silence, punctuated by the occasional gulp of soda. On the desk, amidst empty cans, a gaming mouse, and a stack of notebooks, was one labeled Blueprint 0. The scene might seem ordinary, another teenager glued to his computer, but in just a few months, this quiet, overlooked kid would be running a multi-million-dollar drug empire. His name? Eric. To understand how we got here, we have to rewind. Before the money, the empire, or the chaos, Eric was just a regular high school junior in the sleepy suburb of Willowbrook. Well, regular might be pushing it. Eric was what most people called a nerd. He was the kid who aced every test, spent weekends on obscure coding forums, and got excited about things like data encryption and algorithms. To his classmates, he was invisible, a quiet, awkward presence who rarely made eye contact. The only time Eric stood out was when someone needed a favor. A math problem solved before the bell rang, a hacked vending machine that dispensed free snacks, or a fake doctor's note that looked shockingly real. Eric could do it all. But he didn't charge for these services, at least not yet. For Eric, life wasn't about money or popularity. It was about the satisfaction of solving a problem, the thrill of outsmarting the system. Eric's parents were successful but absent. His mom, a top real estate agent, spent her days running between open houses, and his dad, a tax attorney, was buried in spreadsheets and client calls. They weren't neglectful, they made sure Eric had everything he could want, the latest gadgets, a state-of-the-art gaming PC, and a fridge always stocked with snacks. But their workaholic schedules left Eric alone most of the time, which was fine by him. It gave him the freedom to tinker with his projects uninterrupted. Still, there was a nagging sense of isolation that Eric couldn't shake. He didn't fit in at school, and he wasn't sure he wanted to. The world of high school, football games, parties, and cliques felt alien to him. Until Gavin came along. Gavin was Eric's polar opposite. Where Eric was quiet and introverted, Gavin was loud and confident. He had an easy charm that made teachers laugh at his excuses instead of punishing him, and a smile that could disarm even the most skeptical classmate. He wasn't the smartest guy in the room, but he didn't need to be. Gavin had a gift for persuasion, a knack for making people believe in him, whether they should or not. The two first crossed paths during a chemistry class project. Eric was focused on the assignment, already jotting down calculations, while Gavin leaned back in his chair, twirling a pen. "Let me guess," Gavin said with a grin, "you're the type who'd rather do this whole project alone." Eric looked up, caught off guard. "I mean, yeah, kind of." Gavin laughed. "Cool. I'll handle the presentation part. You do the science-y stuff. Easy 50-50 split." Eric raised an eyebrow. "More like 90-10. Deal." Gavin stuck out his hand. Eric hesitated, then shook it. That handshake would change everything. Over the next few weeks, Gavin latched onto Eric. He wasn't the type to sit still in class, but something about Eric intrigued him. Maybe it was the way Eric could solve any problem thrown at him, or maybe Gavin saw untapped potential in the quiet kid. Whatever it was, their unlikely friendship was born. For Eric, Gavin was a window into a world he didn't understand, a world of parties, shortcuts, and bending rules just for the thrill of it. For Gavin, Eric was a goldmine of untapped brilliance, someone who could make impossible things possible. Together, they made a dangerous combination. The idea came up on a random Tuesday afternoon. They were sitting in the cafeteria, Gavin leaning back in his chair, a smirk on his face. "Do you know how much my brother paid for, like, 2 grams of weed last night?" Gavin said, out of nowhere. Eric blinked. "I don't know." $80. "For crumbs," Gavin said, shaking his head. "It's a joke. You could buy, like, a decent headset for that." Eric shrugged. "That's the market, I guess." Gavin leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with mischief. "But what if we were the market?" Eric froze. What? Think about it, man, Gavin said, lowering his voice. You're a genius. I've seen the stuff you can do with computers. And me? I can sell anything to anyone. What if we started, selling? Eric stared at him, waiting for the punchline. When it didn't come, he said, "You're kidding, right?" "I'm serious," Gavin said. "It doesn't have to be big. Just a side hustle. A few sales here and there. We could make some real money." Eric laughed. "Yeah, no thanks. I'm not trying to go to jail." "Who said anything about getting caught?" Gavin said, grinning. "That's where you come in. You're smart enough to build something no one can trace. Something foolproof." Eric shook his head, but the seed was planted. At first, Eric dismissed the idea as one of Gavin's crazy schemes. But over the next few days, it kept nagging at him. It wasn't the money that tempted him, it was the challenge. Could he actually create a system that was untraceable? Could he outsmart the authorities, the dealers, the entire system? It was the ultimate test of his skills. One night, he found himself sitting at his desk, staring at a blank coding interface. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. Then, almost without thinking, he started typing. What began as a casual experiment quickly became an obsession. Eric worked late into the night, fueled by a mix of caffeine and adrenaline. He built an encrypted app, something sleek and anonymous, that allowed users to place orders without revealing their identities. Payments would be made in Bitcoin, with an automated system that transferred funds through a web of digital wallets, making them impossible to track. When Eric finally showed it to Gavin, his friend was stunned. "Dude," Gavin said, scrolling through the app, "this is insane. You're like a criminal mastermind." Eric smirked, a rare flicker of pride in his eyes. "It's just code." "It's genius," Gavin said. "We're gonna be rich." The plan started small. Gavin sourced the product through an older cousin who dabbled in the business, and Eric stayed behind the scenes, managing the tech. They set up drop points around town, abandoned parks, empty mailboxes, and Gavin handled the transactions. Eric monitored everything from his computer, tracking orders and payments. At first, it was almost too easy. Customers loved the convenience of the app, and word spread quickly. Within a month, they had more orders than they could handle. The money started rolling in, and Gavin's confidence grew with every successful deal. But success has a way of breeding recklessness. One Friday night, Gavin threw a party at his house while his parents were out of town. The place was packed with kids from school, the air thick with cheap beer and bad decisions. Gavin, always the showman, decided to show off. "Yo, free samples for everyone," he shouted, pulling out a handful of small baggies. Eric, who was sitting in a corner with a soda, froze. "What are you doing?" he hissed. "Relax, man," Gavin said, grinning. "It's good marketing. Keep the customers coming back." Eric wanted to argue, but the damage was already done. The baggies disappeared into the crowd, and Eric felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his chest. That's when Sarah showed up. Sarah was the kind of girl who could turn heads without trying. She was confident, charismatic, and just a little intimidating. Gavin had been crushing on her for years, and tonight, she was finally paying attention to him. "Hey, Gavin," she said, flashing him a smile. "Got anything for me?" Gavin, eager to impress, handed her a baggie without hesitation. "For you?" "Always." What he didn't know was that Sarah's dad was a cop. And Sarah? She wasn't exactly discreet. Over the next week, things started spiraling. Sarah bragged to her friends about the hookup she'd scored, and word spread to the wrong people. Meanwhile, Gavin started making bigger deals, pushing Eric to expand the app's reach. Eric tried to keep things under control, but the operation was growing faster than he could manage. And then came the first anonymous threat. An email popped up in Eric's inbox one night. "You don't know who you're messing with. Shut it down, or we will." Eric's heart raced as he stared at the screen. He showed the message to Gavin the next day, but his friend just shrugged it off. "Relax," Gavin said. "It's probably some jealous loser trying to scare us. We're untouchable." But Eric wasn't so sure. For the first time, he started to wonder if they'd gone too far. And just like that, the foundation of their empire began to crack. When things start going wrong, they don't just go wrong, they unravel like a badly knit sweater. The first thread had been pulled, Sarah, the cop's daughter, bragging about her hookup. The second thread came with that ominous email. But the third? That was when Eric and Gavin's little empire truly began to crumble. Gavin was unshaken by the threat, but Eric was spiraling. That night, as he stared at his computer screen, the email still open, he felt the first pangs of real fear. Who sent the message? How had they found him? He thought he'd been careful, more than careful. The app was airtight. Payments were anonymous. Even the drop points were randomized. But as Eric sat there, his mind racing, he realized something terrifying. He wasn't dealing with ordinary customers anymore. The operation had grown too big, too fast, and now they were on someone else's radar, someone who didn't want competition. Gavin, as usual, brushed it off. "Dude, you're overthinking this," he said, tossing a basketball lazily in his backyard. "It's probably just some small-time dealer who's mad we're cutting into their profits. Let them be mad." "Gavin, we got an anonymous threat," Eric snapped, pacing back and forth. "That's not something you ignore. What if they're serious?" "They won't do anything," Gavin said with a shrug. "They're all talk." Eric stopped pacing and turned to him. "What if they're not?" Gavin smirked. "Then we handle it." "Easy." Eric wanted to believe him, but deep down, he knew better. The first real blow came a week later. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon, and Eric was in his room, monitoring the app. Orders were coming in as usual, but one caught his attention. It was a massive order, way bigger than anything they'd handled before. Eric hesitated. Something about it felt off. The user had paid in full, but the delivery instructions were oddly specific, a deserted parking lot on the edge of town, late at night. Eric's instinct screamed at him to decline it, but Gavin, of course, had other plans. "Are you kidding me?" Gavin said when Eric showed him the order. "This is huge. Do you know how much we're making off this one deal?" "I don't care about the money," Eric said. "It's too risky." "Everything's a risk," Gavin said, rolling his eyes. "But you don't win big if you don't play big. Come on, man. Trust me." Against his better judgment, Eric agreed. He coded the drop into the system, set the delivery for midnight, and tried to push the nagging sense of dread out of his mind. Midnight came, and Gavin, ever the showman, insisted on making the delivery himself. "You worry too much," he told Eric as he grabbed the package. "I'll be fine." Eric stayed up, glued to his computer, tracking Gavin's location through his phone. He watched the blinking dot move across the map, his anxiety growing with every passing minute. Then the dot stopped. Eric leaned closer to the screen. Gavin had reached the drop point, but he wasn't moving. Seconds turned into minutes. Eric's heart pounded. He tried calling Gavin, but it went straight to voicemail. Something was wrong. Gavin finally showed up at Eric's house an hour later, his face pale, his hands trembling. He dropped the package on Eric's desk. "What happened?" Eric demanded. "It was a setup," Gavin said, his voice shaking. "No one showed up, but someone was watching. I saw a car parked across the lot. They didn't get out, just sat there, staring." Eric's stomach dropped. "Did they follow you?" "I don't think so," Gavin said, though he didn't sound convinced. Eric stared at the package on his desk, his mind racing. "We're shutting this down," he said finally. "The app, the deals, everything. We're done." "No way," Gavin said, shaking his head. This was a one-off. We can't just walk away from this kind of money. Gavin, someone's on to us. Eric snapped. Do you not get that? Relax, Gavin said, though the panic in his eyes betrayed his calm tone. We'll lay low for a bit, but we're not shutting down. We've got too much riding on this. Eric wanted to argue, but he knew it was pointless. Gavin wasn't going to stop, and Eric wasn't sure he could stop him. The next few weeks were tense. Eric tried to keep things under control, but Gavin was pushing harder than ever. He started making deals behind Eric's back, using the app to set up bigger and riskier transactions. Eric felt like he was losing grip on the empire they'd built, and the stress was eating away at him. And then the second threat came. This time, it wasn't an email. It was a note, scrawled in messy handwriting, left on Eric's front porch. We warned you. Last chance. Shut it down, or you'll regret it. Eric's hand shook as he read the note. He called Gavin immediately. We're done, Eric said, his voice firm. I'm serious this time. I'm shutting the app down. You're overreacting, Gavin said, but even he sounded less confident. No, Gavin, Eric said. This is serious. We've pissed off the wrong people. I'm not getting dragged down because you can't let this go. Gavin sighed. Fine. Shut it down. But don't blame me when you regret leaving all that money on the table. Eric spent the next 48 hours dismantling everything he'd built. He deleted the app, wiped the servers, and transferred their remaining Bitcoin into an untraceable wallet. By the end of it, he felt like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. But the relief was short-lived. 3 days later, Eric came home to find his front door ajar. His stomach turned as he stepped inside, his heart racing. The living room was trashed, cushions ripped open, furniture overturned. His computer was gone. Eric ran upstairs to his room, but it was the same story. His desk was empty, his notebook scattered across the floor. And on his bed was another note, we warned you. Eric called Gavin, his voice trembling. They know where I live. What? Gavin said, sounding genuinely alarmed. Are you okay? No, I'm not okay. Eric snapped. They broke into my house, Gavin. This isn't just some stupid game anymore. Okay, calm down, Gavin said. We'll figure this out. No, Eric said firmly. I'm done. I'm out. You can do whatever you want, but I'm done. Eric, come on. Goodbye, Gavin. Eric hung up, his hands shaking. For a while, it seemed like things might finally go back to normal. Eric stayed off the grid, avoided Gavin, and tried to focus on school. But the paranoia never left. He found himself looking over his shoulder, jumping at every sound. He started avoiding people altogether, retreating further into his shell. And then, one night, his phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. We're not finished with you yet. Eric stared at the screen, his chest tightening. He thought he'd escaped, but he was wrong. The game wasn't over. It was just beginning. Eric's days blurred into an endless haze of dread and paranoia after Gavin's arrest. The morning news had splashed Gavin's face across every channel, dubbing him the teen tech Kingpin. Watching the broadcast, Eric's stomach churned as the reporter spoke with a hint of awe about the operation Gavin had masterminded. But Eric knew the truth, he'd been the brains behind the entire empire. And if anyone dug deep enough, they'd find the digital breadcrumbs leading straight back to him. Eric couldn't shake the feeling that every shadow harbored an agent, every passing car was a surveillance van, and every knock at the door would be his downfall. Yet, despite his fear, the only thing more terrifying than the law was the unknown. Gavin's arrest wasn't the end of this mess, it was just the beginning. The first sign of trouble came a week later. Eric had just sat down to eat a microwave dinner when he heard a faint tapping on his bedroom window. Freezing, he slowly turned his head, but the curtains were closed. For a moment, he thought he was imagining things. but then the tapping came again, more insistent. Heart pounding, Eric grabbed the nearest blunt object, which happened to be an old tennis racket, and cautiously approached the window. Pulling back the curtain, he was met with the wide-eyed, pale face of Liam, one of Gavin's friends. Eric opened the window just enough to hiss, "What the hell are you doing here?" "You have to let me in," Liam whispered, his breath fogging up the glass. "They're watching me." "Who's watching you?" Eric asked, but Liam's frantic expression gave him his answer. Eric opened the window further, letting Liam climb awkwardly inside. Liam's clothes were soaked, and his hands were trembling as he grabbed Eric's arm. "I don't know what Gavin got us into, man, but they're coming for us." "Us?" Eric asked, his voice rising. "You weren't even involved." "That doesn't matter." Liam snapped. "They think I know something. I've been getting messages, weird calls. One guy even followed me home last night. I didn't know where else to go." Eric sat down, his mind racing. This was worse than he'd thought. Whoever these people were, they weren't just targeting Gavin, they were casting a wide net. And now Liam was dragging more heat into Eric's already precarious situation. "Listen," Eric said, trying to stay calm. "You need to stay under the radar. Don't talk to anyone. Don't post anything online. And for God's sake, stop coming to my house in the middle of the night." Liam nodded, but the haunted look in his eyes told Eric that the damage was already done. He wasn't the only one cracking under pressure. A few days later, Eric received a package at his doorstep. It was wrapped in plain brown paper with no return address, but his name was scrawled on it in black marker. Eric's first instinct was to throw it in the trash, but curiosity, or maybe stupidity, got the better of him. Inside was a burner phone and a single note, "Answer when it rings." Eric stared at the phone, a sinking feeling settling in his chest. This wasn't a request, it was a command. He didn't dare ignore it. The phone rang that evening. The voice on the other end was cold and mechanical, distorted to mask its identity. "Eric Whitman," the voice began, and Eric's heart nearly stopped. "We know who you are." Eric stammered, trying to deny everything, but the voice cut him off. "Save it. We don't care about your excuses. Gavin may have been the face, but you were the brains. And now you work for us." "Work for you?" Eric asked, his throat dry. "I'm out. I shut everything down." "Not anymore," the voice replied. "You'll follow our instructions, or we'll make sure you take the fall for everything. Your choice." The call ended before Eric could respond, leaving him with the cold realization that he was now a pawn in someone else's game. Over the next few weeks, Eric was drawn deeper into the shadows. The mysterious group, whoever they were, kept their identity hidden but made their demands clear. Eric was tasked with building a new, more advanced version of the app, one that couldn't be traced and could handle larger transactions. They supplied him with resources, encrypted servers, new hardware, and a constant stream of burner phones to avoid detection. Eric felt like he was walking a tightrope. On one hand, he knew the group was dangerous, capable of making good on their threats. On the other hand, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were testing him, probing for weaknesses. Meanwhile, Liam's paranoia grew worse. He started showing up at Eric's house unannounced, rambling about cars parked outside his place or strange men at the corner store. Eric tried to keep him calm, but he was barely holding himself together. One night, Liam burst through the door, his face pale and his breathing ragged. "They got Gavin to flip," he gasped. "What are you talking about?" Eric asked, dread pooling in his stomach. "I heard it from a guy who knows someone in county jail," Liam said, pacing the room. "Gavin's talking to the feds. He's giving them names, Eric." Eric's blood ran cold. If Gavin was cooperating, it was only a matter of time before his name came up. He needed a plan, and fast. Eric decided to confront Gavin himself. It wasn't easy, he had to use a fake name to get into the visitor log at the jail. When he finally sat across from Gavin in the cold, fluorescent-lit visitation room, he barely recognized him. Gavin looked thinner, his cocky demeanor replaced with a weary, hollow expression. "Eric?" Gavin asked, his eyes narrowing. "What are you doing here?" "I need to know if it's true," Eric said, his voice low. "Are you talking to the feds?" Gavin leaned back in his chair, a bitter smile on his face. "Of course I am. What do you think I'm gonna do, rot in here while you get off scot-free?" Eric clenched his fists under the table. "You're putting a target on my back." "You put it there yourself," Gavin shot back. "You were the one who built the app. I just used it. They'll figure that out sooner or later." Eric stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You're making a mistake, Gavin." "No," Gavin said, his smile fading. "The mistake was trusting you." Eric left the jail feeling more trapped than ever. Gavin's betrayal was a ticking time bomb, and the mysterious group pulling his strings wasn't going to wait around for the explosion. The next twist came unexpectedly. Late one night, Eric was working on the app when his computer screen suddenly went black. Before he could panic, a message appeared: "We need to meet. Come alone." Eric's heart pounded as he stared at the screen. He had no idea how they'd hacked into his system, but he didn't doubt their ability. He typed back, "Where?" The response came immediately: "The abandoned factory on 8th Street. Midnight. Don't be late." Eric knew it was a trap. But he also knew he didn't have a choice. When Eric arrived at the factory, the air was thick with tension. The building was dark, its windows shattered, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed through the space. Eric's footsteps felt unnaturally loud as he entered. A group of men emerged from the shadows, their faces obscured by masks. One of them stepped forward, his posture commanding. "Eric Whitman," he said, his voice eerily familiar. "Welcome to the real world." Eric swallowed hard. "What do you want from me?" The man chuckled. "You're not in a position to ask questions. But since you're curious, this is bigger than you, bigger than Gavin, bigger than some high school side hustle. You've built something extraordinary. Now you're going to use it for us." Eric looked around, his mind racing. These weren't petty criminals, they were organized, methodical, and clearly well-funded. He realized with a sinking feeling that he was in way over his head. But before he could respond, another voice rang out from the shadows. "That's enough." Everyone turned to see a figure stepping forward, Liam. His face was set with a determination Eric had never seen before, and in his hand was a recording device. "What the hell are you doing, Liam?" Eric whispered, his voice panicked. "Ending this," Liam said, holding up the device. "I've been recording everything. If you don't let us go, this goes straight to the cops." The masked man laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "You think that's going to scare us?" "No," Liam said, his hand steady. "But I think it'll scare the people you answer to." For a moment, the room was silent. Then, to Eric's astonishment, the man nodded. "Smart kid. Too smart for your own good." He motioned to his men, and they disappeared into the shadows. "You just bought yourself some time," the man said to Eric. "Don't waste it." As the men vanished, Eric turned to Liam, his legs shaking. "What were you thinking?" "Saving your ass," Liam said with a weak smile. "You're welcome." Eric didn't feel saved. If anything, he felt more trapped than ever. But for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this after all. Eric thought the worst had passed after Liam's bold stunt. But that moment of hope evaporated as quickly as it came. The men who had threatened him didn't disappear completely, they were simply recalibrating, watching him from the shadows like predators waiting for the right moment to strike. Eric knew this wasn't over, and he couldn't count on luck or Liam's bravado to save him again. It was time to take control of the situation before it spiraled out of his grasp entirely. In the days following the encounter at the factory, Eric doubled down on his work. not for the criminal organization's benefit, but to create a backdoor into the system he was being forced to rebuild. If he was going to bring these people down, he'd need evidence, something concrete to hand over to the authorities that wouldn't incriminate himself in the process. Every keystroke felt like walking a tightrope. Eric knew they were monitoring him, and any sign of disobedience could lead to disastrous consequences. But his tech-savvy brain worked in overdrive, masking his true intentions beneath layers of code. Meanwhile, Liam became Eric's reluctant partner in crime, or rather, injustice. After his stunt at the factory, Liam refused to stay on the sidelines. He was constantly buzzing with nervous energy, checking every corner of the house for hidden bugs or surveillance cameras and scouring forums for any trace of the organization's activities. "Liam," Eric muttered one evening, his fingers flying over the keyboard, "you don't have to do this. You've already done more than enough." "Are you kidding me?" Liam shot back, pacing across the room. "I'm knee-deep in this mess now, thanks to you. Besides, I'm not letting you face these lunatics alone. Someone's got to make sure you don't get yourself killed." Eric couldn't help but smirk at that. Liam's loyalty was unexpected, but it was the one thing keeping him from falling apart entirely. Then, out of nowhere, Gavin came back into the picture. It started with a late-night message on one of the burner phones. Eric stared at the text, his heart racing. "We need to meet. I can help." "Gavin!" Eric debated ignoring it, but curiosity, and the nagging fear that Gavin's actions might make things worse, got the better of him. He agreed to meet Gavin at a rundown diner on the outskirts of town, a place where no one would think to look for two teenage criminals. When Gavin arrived, he looked worse than the last time Eric had seen him. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, but there was a flicker of determination behind them. "You're playing with fire, Eric," Gavin said after the waitress poured them both cups of coffee. "These people you're dealing with, they're not like us. They don't make mistakes. They don't leave loose ends. Why do you care?" Eric shot back, his voice low but sharp. "You threw me under the bus the second they arrested you." Gavin flinched but didn't deny it. "I didn't have a choice. They put me in a room with a bunch of suits and told me I'd rot in prison if I didn't talk. But I didn't give them everything." Eric leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "What are you saying?" "I kept some of the heat off you," Gavin admitted. "Not because I'm a saint or anything, but because I knew you'd have a plan. And I was right, wasn't I? You're building something for them, but you're also building a way out." Eric didn't respond, but the flicker in Gavin's eyes told him he'd guessed correctly. "Let me help," Gavin said. "I know I screwed up, but if we're gonna take these guys down, we need to work together." Eric hesitated. Trusting Gavin again felt like walking into a trap, but the desperation in his voice was hard to ignore. "Fine," Eric said after a long pause. "But if you screw me over again, we're done. No second chances." With Gavin's help, Eric's plan began to take shape. The backdoor he built into the system wasn't just for collecting evidence, it was a ticking time bomb designed to bring the entire operation crashing down. Once it was activated, every server, every transaction, every trace of the organization's illegal activities would be exposed to law enforcement. But it wasn't going to be easy. The group was holding Eric on a tight leash, demanding updates on his progress and constantly reminding him of the consequences if he failed. The stress was suffocating, and even Liam's attempts at humor couldn't lighten the mood. The final straw came when the organization ordered Eric to attend a meeting in person, a meeting with one of their top operatives. The thought of facing them directly made Eric's skin crawl, but he knew refusing wasn't an option. The meeting was held at a high-end hotel downtown, in a suite that reeked of money and power. Eric was greeted by a man in a tailored suit, his sharp features and icy demeanor sending a shiver down Eric's spine. "You've done good work," the man said, gesturing for Eric to sit. "But we need assurances. No more games, no more delays. Finish the job, or we finish you." Eric nodded, keeping his expression neutral, but inside, his resolve hardened. If they wanted assurances, he'd give them something they'd never forget. The night of the takedown, everything came to a head. Eric, Gavin, and Liam worked together to launch the backdoor program, timing it perfectly with a major transaction the group had planned. As soon as the program went live, Eric's computer screen lit up with streams of data, every piece of incriminating evidence flooding into an encrypted database. But just as Eric was about to trigger the final sequence, his phone buzzed. It was a message from the group: "We know what you're doing. You have 10 minutes to stop, or we're coming for you." Eric's blood turned to ice. How had they found out? "We have to go," Gavin said, grabbing Eric by the arm. "They're onto us." "No," Eric said, his voice firm. "We finish this. If we run, they win." The next few minutes were a blur. Liam worked to delay the group's attempts to shut down the program, while Gavin kept watch at the window, his nerves on edge. Eric focused on the code, his fingers moving faster than they ever had before. Finally, with seconds to spare, he hit the final key. The program executed perfectly, sending the data to law enforcement and wiping the servers clean. But the victory was short-lived. The sound of tires screeching outside sent a wave of panic through the room. "They're here," Gavin said, his voice barely above a whisper. Eric, Gavin, and Liam barely made it out the back door before the group stormed the house. They ran through the dark streets, their breaths ragged and their hearts pounding. Eric's mind raced, trying to come up with a plan, but there was nowhere to go. Then, out of nowhere, police sirens filled the air. Blue and red lights illuminated the streets as squad cars surrounded the area. The group's men scattered, some trying to fight, others fleeing in panic. Eric watched from a distance as law enforcement descended on the scene, arresting the operatives and seizing what was left of their operation. It was over. Or so he thought. In the days that followed, Eric, Gavin, and Liam went their separate ways. Eric had managed to avoid arrest by carefully covering his tracks, but the experience had changed him. He'd gone from a nervous, nerdy teenager to someone who had faced down a criminal empire and survived. Gavin, surprisingly, had a change of heart. He turned himself in, hoping to make amends for his mistakes. Liam, ever the paranoid one, decided to leave town altogether, disappearing without a trace. As for Eric, he knew he'd never be the same. The scars of what he'd been through ran deep, but so did the lessons he'd learned. Sometimes, survival isn't about being the smartest or the strongest, it's about knowing when to take a stand and when to walk away.